glad you could make it today. Our lesson comes from the book of Second Kings, starting in chapter 17. And what we've got here is the end of the kingdom of Israel. And you may recall that at one time Israel had been a nation of all 12 tribes of Israel, but it had split after Solomon died and was now the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. Now, the kingdom of Israel had bad kings from the beginning all the way to the end. And we find out that Hoshea, the last of their kings, wasn't as bad as the other guys, but still, this was a country with major problems that the Bible spells out, in that they would not follow the real God. They would follow these pretend gods and do all kinds of things that God had said do not do, and following these pretend gods that God said do not follow. In a sense, they just did whatever God told them not to do, and their end was coming. And when they rebelled against Assyria, the end was assured. Now, what you had was the Assyrian Empire, which, think of a country, but a very huge country that was controlling a lot of countries around it. So what they would do is say, okay, we've got this huge army. We don't want to go to all of the trouble of conquering you. Um, we will leave you alone if you'll send us money or provide soldiers or anything they ask for. And so Israel had been doing that, and it appears that Judah had been similarly influenced to uh, provide what they call tribute to the Assyrian Empire. Well, um, Hoshea rebelled against this. He had really been trying to make a deal with the Egyptians so that they would come in and help him fight off the Assyrians, and then he would be in a lot better shape. The Assyrians found out about it. They came in, they put the capital of Israel, which was Samaria, under siege for 3 years. So they had their army camped around it for 3 years and eventually took it over. And what we have are the 10 tribes that were represented in Israel more or less disappear from history at that point. Now, I exaggerate that a little bit, but that's what people say. The major groupings of the tribes were taken to other parts of the empire, and that was pretty common when you had a huge country that was called an empire. When they captured a place, they would separate the people and send some of them to one place, some of them to another place, so that they would never have to worry about those people revolting against them again. And so the Israelites from Israel, who had not been uh, in favor of following the false gods, meaning the ones who had followed God all along, had pretty much already moved down to Judah, where sometimes you had a good king who would follow God, and sometimes you didn't. So those people had sacrificed a lot, and we see traces of them on into the New Testament. So those 10 tribes didn't disappear completely at that time, but they were greatly diminished. So that's the end of Israel. Now Judah is on its own, and they have a king who uh, soon is in charge of Judah, and his name is Hezekiah. And it appears that he was trained as king while his father was still alive. I believe his father's name was Ahaz. Ahaz really was not a good guy. Hezekiah was. What we find out about Hezekiah is that when you look at everything he did, he was not the smartest guy to be a king. He made a lot of mistakes and did a lot of things that were questionable, but he had strong faith in God and wanted to follow God and do what was right, to the point that the Bible describes him as being much like David, and that's a great compliment indeed for anyone. Well, with Hezekiah, he is also not inclined to do what the Assyrians want him to do, and he starts making preemptive strikes. He fights against the Philistines, who have been a problem for Israel and Judah for hundreds of years. And he's also fortifying his cities, and likewise, um, it appears that he was talking to the Egyptians, or at least he was not greatly opposed to the Egyptians fighting against Assyria. So what we have are a couple of instances that take place with Hezekiah that we really want to look at. And what happens is the Assyrians see that Hezekiah is a problem. So they turn their army toward Judah and they send them down. And this is a strong army. Now, what happens with this is something that we should pay attention to. They come against Hezekiah, and they're sending messages ahead of time and saying that, okay, you depend on this God, but you tore down all these high places. And what they don't realize is that these high places were ones that God was against. God had said, you pray at the temple and that's it. And there were all these other places people had where they wanted to pray. Well, the thing is, it was often used for prayer to these false gods. See, the Assyrians did not understand things with God. And so they're thinking that, okay, Hezekiah is depending on a God who's not going to help him. But that's just it. Hezekiah is depending on the only God who can help him, the only God there is. Well, the Assyrians take over this one fortified city, and they're going around and taking over the others. And Jerusalem, which is the capital city of Judah, is next on their list, and they move up against it, and they send some people up to talk to the officials of Judah. And the ones who are representing Judah say, oh, speak to us in Aramaic, not in Hebrew. Well, the Jewish people spoke Hebrew. Now, Aramaic was a language that was popular in several of the countries in that area. And so generally, if you were speaking in Aramaic, it was so that you could talk to people whose normal language was something different from your own. So this was a way they could communicate. But the Assyrians spoke to them in Hebrew. They wanted all the people to hear what they had to say. And again, they repeated, oh, Hezekiah is fooling you. He can't stop us. We've conquered. And they start listing off name after name of the cities they have taken and the gods of those cities. See, again, they're coming back and they're insulting God, not Hezekiah. Well, God takes offense to that, and rightly so. And we find that the prophet Isaiah talks with Hezekiah. And of course, Hezekiah has torn his clothes, as has his upper officials, showing their distress, their making themselves low in the eyes of God. They realize that they have to have God's help. And Isaiah pretty much says, oh, you're getting God's help. You just watch and see what happens. Well, the king of the Assyrians is named Sennacherib. Well, one of the things Isaiah says is that Sennacherib is going to hear a report, and that's going to draw him away. And it does. They hear that the Egyptians are on the march toward them, and Sennacherib leaves. Another thing that Isaiah says is that, oh, he's going to end up going back home, and he's going to be killed there. You'll never have to worry about him again. Well, that eventually does happen. Sennacherib does not come back, but he's got a general there in charge of things, and it still looks pretty rough for Judah if you're not counting on God to save the day. Well, God does save the day, but in a way no one would have expected. He sends an angel. Okay, and you think, all right, angels are pretty tough. How many does he send? One. Okay, well, how big is this army going up against Judah? 185,000 soldiers. Okay, that's a lot of soldiers. Can one angel fight and beat that many? Well, it turns out, yes. In one night, this one angel kills all of the Assyrian army. And that's it. Jerusalem has been saved, and it's pretty clear that God did this. The people of Judah know this for sure. Hezekiah knows this for sure, and they don't worry about the Assyrians anymore. Now, uh, not too long after this, and I'd say not too long in number of years after this, something else happens. Um, okay, the Assyrians are no longer a problem, but King Hezekiah becomes ill, and Isaiah sent to him to tell him that he's going to die. And you think, okay, this is really a different story, but this is to illustrate something else that's going on, because as we look at the kingdom of Judah, we go from one king to the next king to the next king, and some are good and some are bad. So you have Ahaz, who was bad. His son Hezekiah is pretty good, I mean really good for a king, and we're going to see it tilt back the other way now. Well, the message Isaiah gives to Hezekiah as he's lying there sick, saying that God wanted me to tell you that you're not going to recover from this illness, you're going to die. And Isaiah leaves. Well, Hezekiah rolls over facing the wall and begins crying and calling out to God that uh, he's tried to do the right thing, the things he has done for God. Some people see this as selfish of him, um, maybe, or maybe it's just someone who's just extremely upset about things, thinking that he's being punished even though he has served God all this time. Well, before Isaiah gets gone too far, God gives him a message. Go back and tell Hezekiah he's going to live another 15 years. Okay, so Isaiah goes back. He tells Hezekiah this, and Hezekiah does live another 15 years. And what happens is when he dies, his 12-year-old son, Manasseh, becomes king, and Manasseh reigns for over 50 years, and he's a real bad king. He doesn't follow God at all. And so we look at this, and our big lesson in this one is clear. If Hezekiah had died when God originally told him he would die, Manasseh would not have been born. Manasseh would not have had a long reign, and it's likely that Judah would have had a good king instead of a bad king. It's just Hezekiah didn't understand the whole story. So we see this as sometimes someone may die who is a good person, and it may be preventing great evil from occurring later, great evil that we could not um, understand is on its way. So that's a big lesson for us. You have Hezekiah who tries to follow God, uh, doesn't always do the right thing, but is trying to do the right thing. And as we see, he's regarded as a very good king, a very good guy. So you don't have to be the smartest person. You just have to submit your will to God and try to do your best with what you know, what God wants you to do. All right, with that, I'm going to let you go, and I hope you'll be back next time. Bye.